Today we're going to explore a side of ancient history that rarely appears in books. We're going to talk about invisible economies, the parallel markets that moved the daily lives of millions of people in ancient civilizations. It's a story about survival, creativity, and human nature in its purest form. It's worth staying until the end because you'll discover how the ancient world really worked, far beyond official records and the grand narratives of empires. So get comfortable, turn off the lights if you want, and let's go. Shadows of history. What official records don't tell? Imagine for a moment the ancient cities of the Mediterranean at dusk. The sun sets slowly over the horizon, tinting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The main streets begin to empty, the official markets close their heavy wooden doors, and the noise of the day gives way to a different kind of silence. But it's not complete silence. If you paid attention, you'd hear something different beginning. Discreet footsteps in narrow alleys, the low murmur of conversations in dark corners, the soft clinking of coins changing hands in places where no scribe would record these transactions. It was the beginning of another kind of commerce, a commerce that existed in the shadows but was just as vital as the official market illuminated by the morning sun. The history we learn in schools usually comes from official records, temple documents, king's decrees, tax lists engraved in clay or written on papyrus. These records tell us about great conquests, laws, tributes collected. But there's something they don't tell. There's an entire dimension of ancient life that simply doesn't appear in official archives. Think about it this way. If a merchant in ancient Rome sold salt without paying taxes, he wouldn't record that anywhere, right? If a family in ancient Egypt exchanged grain for textiles outside the official tribute system, no royal scribe would document that transaction. These exchanges happened but left few traces. It's as if an entire world existed, functioning in parallel, invisible to authorities, but absolutely essential for the survival of common people. Archaeologists find clues here and there, a hidden deposit of amphorae with goods that shouldn't be in that region, metal ingots buried in strange places far from official trade routes, small secret compartments in merchant ships. Each of these discoveries tells a different story from the official version. Do we live so differently today? How many informal transactions happen every day, outside official records, driven by the same needs that drove people 3,000 years ago? Let's call this parallel world the shadow economy. It's not exactly what we think when we hear black market today. We're not necessarily talking about cartels or criminal organizations in the modern sense. We're talking about something much broader and, in a way, more human. In antiquity, the shadow economy included everything from the small farmer who sold part of his harvest without declaring it to the tax collector, to sophisticated smuggling networks that moved spices along the Silk Road. It included the widow who sold homemade bread on the corner without an official license, and the merchant who found creative ways to hide loads of precious metals to avoid absurd customs duties. The smell of smuggled spices was unmistakable: cinnamon, pepper, cumin, aromas worth their weight in gold, hidden under layers of common linen, or mixed with legal loads of grain. If you walked near certain warehouses in the port of Alexandria at night, you'd smell that exotic perfume floating in the humid Mediterranean air, mixed with the smell of salt and wet wood. This invisible economy wasn't just about greed or criminality. It was about survival. It was about ordinary people trying to live in a world where taxes could consume half the harvest, where certain products were monopolized by the state, where the law often favored the powerful and suffocated the vulnerable. There's something almost poetic about it. Official history tells us about emperors and generals, about battles and treaties, but real history, the kind that affected the daily lives of millions of people, often happened in these silent exchanges, in these networks of trust built far from the eyes of authorities. And here's the fascinating part. In many cases, the governments themselves knew about these parallel economies and in a way tolerated their existence, because there was an implicit understanding. If the state tightened control too much, if it tried to completely eliminate these informal markets, it risked a revolt. People needed these escape valves. They needed ways to survive when the official system failed. It was a delicate balance, a cat and mouse game where sometimes the cat pretended not to see the mouse, as long as the mouse didn't get too bold. If you're enjoying our stories, subscribe to the channel to help our community grow and receive notifications of new stories. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is. It's fascinating for us to know where our community is around the world. So when we talk about the shadow economy in antiquity, we're talking about a complex and sophisticated system, a system that had its own unwritten rules, its own networks of trust, its own methods of communication and transportation. It was an invisible web that connected people across continents, across different languages and cultures. In the next few hours, we're going to explore this fascinating world. We'll discover how these networks worked, which products were most smuggled and why, how people developed ingenious methods to hide goods, how secret codes and signals allowed strangers to trust each other in transactions that couldn't be formalized. We'll get to know the physical places where these deals happened. Taverns by candlelight, where agreements were sealed with a handshake and a glass of wine. Caravans that followed alternative routes through deserts and mountains, avoiding official checkpoints. Nighttime ports where cargo was unloaded in silence, far from the eyes of tax collectors. And we'll understand how this invisible economy not only survived alongside the official economy, but often influenced it in surprising ways. How smugglers sometimes discovered trade routes that later became official. How the pressure of these parallel markets forced states to change their taxation policies. How technological innovations were born from the need to hide and transport goods more efficiently. It's a story about human resilience, about how ordinary people find ways to prosper or at least survive even when official circumstances work against them. About how necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, and perhaps in the end we'll discover that we're not so different from our ancestors. The same forces that shaped those invisible markets thousands of years ago are still present today. The search for survival, the desire for autonomy, human creativity in the face of obstacles, but we'll explore all of this calmly, letting each detail reveal its own story. Because this is a theme that deserves to be savored slowly, like a good ancient wine, letting each layer of complexity reveal itself in its own time. Defining the invisible parallel markets and their nuances. So what exactly was this shadow economy in the ancient world? Can we really call it a black market in the sense we know today? To understand this, you need to imagine the complexity of ancient economic life. It wasn't simple like having an official economy on one side and a criminal economy on the other. It was much more nuanced than that. There were layers upon layers of informality, each with its own rules and motivations. Think of a typical morning in a city like Antioch in the 2nd century AD. The sun rises over the terracotta rooftops, illuminating the still empty streets. The fresh dawn air carries the smell of bread being baked in clay ovens scattered throughout the city. Early, even before the official market opens, you'd already see movement. A woman crosses the square with a basket covered by a linen cloth. Inside, bread, still warm. She doesn't have an official license to sell, but everyone in the neighborhood knows her bread. It's better and cheaper than the licensed bakers 3 streets down. She stops at a few doors, exchanges bread for coins or other products, small transactions that no one records, that no tax collector knows exist. Is this the shadow economy? Technically, yes, but calling this woman a criminal? Would be strange, wouldn't it? She's just trying to survive, using the skills she has. She's not hurting anyone. She's simply existing outside the official system of licenses and taxation. Now think of another scenario. Later the same day, a ship docks at the port. Officially, it's carrying amphorae of wine from Hispania. And there really is wine there. But at the bottom of the hold, hidden under layers of empty amphorae, are silver ingots. Silver that should have passed through the imperial mint, where it would have been heavily taxed. The ship's captain has arrangements with certain merchants in the city. They know the silver will arrive. They already have buyers waiting. This operation is more complex. It involves planning, bribing port officials, networks of trust established over years. The profit is considerable, but so are the risks. If discovered, the penalties are severe. This is already another category of shadow economy. More organized, more aware of its illegality, so we can make a useful distinction here. There was what we can call the informal economy and what would more properly be the black market. The informal economy was that of the unlicensed baker. It was the farmer who kept part of the harvest to sell directly, without going through official intermediaries and their fees. It was the craftsman who did extra work at night, repairing tools or weaving baskets, without declaring this additional income. It was informal, but not necessarily ill-intentioned. It was just life happening in the spaces between official rules. The black market, on the other hand, was more structured. It involved high-value goods or products whose commercialization was restricted. Rare spices, precious metals, silk from China, amber from the Baltic, products that crossed borders through unofficial routes, avoiding customs posts where heavy taxes would be charged. But here's the fascinating part. The line between these two categories was often quite thin, blurred. A small merchant who started selling a few loaves of bread could, over time, expand to other products. Maybe they'd start bringing spices from outside the city, buying from suppliers who, in turn, had their own informal networks. Before they knew it, they were participating in a much larger parallel trade network. On the banks of the Nile, in the shade of palm trees swaying gently in the breeze from the river, similar agreements happened every day. The sound of running water mixed with the low murmur of negotiations. Fishermen exchanged part of their catch directly with farmers without going through the official records of the temples that monopolized much of the food trade. The smell of fresh fish mixed with the aroma of dried grains created a characteristic atmosphere of these informal meetings. It was an ancient ritual repeated generation after generation, long before the complex bureaucracies of the pharaohs existed. How do you think trust worked in these systems? When you can't make an official contract, when there's no court to appeal to if someone cheats you, how do you trust strangers? The answer is reputation. The shadow economy worked based on networks of reputation. If a merchant cheated you, word spread. And in the ancient world, where communities were smaller and more interconnected than we imagine, losing your reputation meant losing your livelihood. There's an expression used in various ancient cultures, variations of the idea, your word is your bond. In the official world, contracts were written and witnessed. In the shadow world, your word had to be worth more than any document because it was all you had. This created, curiously, a system that was sometimes more rigorous than the official one, because breaking an official contract could result in a fine or legal process. But breaking your word in the shadow economy, that could mean the complete end of your ability to trade, to survive. So there was this interesting irony, an illegal system that in many ways depended on stricter ethical standards than the legal system. Another aspect that needs to be understood, the shadow economy wasn't just about physical products. Services were also traded informally. A blacksmith who repaired tools outside his official hours a scribe who, for a price, drafted documents that wouldn't go through official channels, private teachers who taught reading and writing without authorization from the authorities. In ancient Rome, for example, there was a whole underworld of informal educational services, freed slaves, many of them highly educated, who offered private lessons. Some families preferred these tutors to the official ones, not only because of the lower price, but because they could directly negotiate the curriculum, the hours, the methods. And there's more. The shadow economy also included what today we'd call the favor economy. Exchanges that didn't even involve money or goods, but services for services. You help fix my roof, I help you with the harvest. You take care of my children when I need to travel, I share my batch of bread with you. These exchanges were totally invisible to any taxation system. How do you tax a favor? How do you record mutual help? But these relationships were the glue that kept communities functioning, especially the poorest ones. At night, in villages scattered throughout the empire, when the official work of the day ended, it was common to see families gathering, not just for leisure, but out of practical necessity. Under the flickering light of oil lamps, women wove together, men repaired tools, children learned trades. All of this outside the official gaze, creating value that would never be recorded on any papyrus or clay tablet. The creaking of spinning wheels created a constant, almost meditative rhythm. The smell of lamp oil mixed with wool created an atmosphere of quiet work. These were moments where economy and community merged in ways that no official scribe could capture. Have we lost something of this today? This ability to create value through direct relationships without official intermediaries? So to summarize this distinction, the ancient shadow economy was a spectrum. On one side, there was pure and simple informality, people just living and exchanging without caring much about licenses and records. On the other side, there were sophisticated smuggling operations involving high-value products, complex routes, and considerable risk. In the middle, there was every kind of variation, and most ordinary people participated in this system at some level, even without thinking of it as something illegal. It was just how life worked. Official rules were one thing, practical reality was another. And here's something that will come up repeatedly in this story. Ancient states knew this. They weren't naive. They knew there was an entire economy functioning outside their records. But there was a pragmatic calculation happening. Trying to completely control all economic activity was impossible. It would require a gigantic bureaucratic apparatus, expensive, and probably unpopular. So in practice, there was implicit tolerance. The state focused on controlling large operations, the most valuable products, the richest merchants. Small informal trade, it often went unnoticed or was consciously ignored. It was practical wisdom. Letting people breathe, letting these economic escape valves exist, could be the difference between stability and revolt. But when someone got too brazen, when informal operations grew to the point of threatening state revenues or political control, then came the reprisals. Market raids, confiscation of goods, exemplary punishments. It was a constant balance, a complex dance between authority and autonomy, between control and freedom, that defined much of ancient economic life. And in this dance, the most ingenious strategies were born, the most creative methods of hiding, transporting, and exchanging, because necessity, truly, is the mother of invention. Necessity, not greed, the roots of the invisible economy. So why did people turn to these parallel markets? Was it simply greed, a desire to profit more by avoiding taxes? Or was something deeper happening? The truth is that for most people in antiquity, participating in the shadow economy wasn't an ambitious choice. It was a matter of survival. It was the difference between eating and going hungry, between having a roof over your head or having nowhere to sleep. Imagine a small farmer in Galilee in the 1st century. He wakes before dawn when the air is still cold and damp with the night's dew. The sky begins to lighten slowly, moving from deep black to shades of dark blue, then purple, until the first golden rays of sun touch the wheat fields. He works the land with his own hands. He feels the rough texture of the hoe handle worn by years of use. The smell of fresh turned earth mixes with the aroma of wild herbs growing at the field's edges. It's hard work, leaving his back aching and his hands calloused. After months caring for the crop, fighting drought, protecting against pests, the harvest finally comes. He looks at his fields and calculates he has enough grain to feed his family for the next year, if all goes well. Maybe even a little extra to trade for other needs. But then the collectors arrive. First, the Roman tax collector. By law, he must hand over a portion of the harvest to the empire. Then the temple representative, who collects the religious tithe. Then still, the landlord, who also wants his share because, technically, the farmer doesn't own the land he works. When all the collectors leave, he looks at what's left, and he realizes with a tightness in his chest, it's not enough. It won't feed the family until the next harvest. What does he do? He has a few options. He can accept hunger. He can try to borrow, going into debt. Or he can do what generations before him did, hide part of the harvest before the collectors arrive. Is it illegal? Yes. Is it immoral? Depends on your point of view. For the state, it's theft. For the farmer, it's survival. And you, what would you do in this situation? This was the reality for countless people in the ancient world. Taxation wasn't just heavy. In many cases, it was simply unsustainable. Some historians estimate that in certain regions of the Roman Empire, the total tax burden could reach 40% or even 50% of production. Now, 40% or 50% might not seem like that much if you think in modern terms, where we have infrastructure, public services, health systems. But in antiquity, what did the common citizen receive in exchange for these taxes? Very little. Most taxes went to finance armies, build palaces, support the elite. So for many people, avoiding taxes wasn't greed. It was simply refusing to participate in a system they saw as fundamentally unjust and exploitative. And it wasn't just about taxes. There were also state monopolies. In many ancient civilizations, the state controlled trade in essential products. In ancient Egypt, for example, the state had a monopoly on grain trade. You were forced to sell your harvest to the state at state-fixed prices, and then buy back at also fixed prices what you needed to survive. You don't need to be an economic genius to see the problem there. Purchase prices were low, sale prices were high, the state profited on both ends, and the producer got squeezed in the middle. In ancient China, salt was an imperial monopoly. Salt, something so basic, so essential for preserving food for human life in general. But you couldn't simply collect salt from the sea or natural deposits and sell it. You had to buy from the state at prices that could be absurdly high. What did this create? A huge incentive for smuggling. Entire groups organized to collect salt illegally, transport it through secret routes, sell it at prices lower than official ones. It was risky. If caught, punishments were severe. But demand was so high and potential profit so large that it was worth the risk. At night, on the coasts of Shandong province, silent groups worked under the moonlight. The rhythmic sound of waves from the Yellow Sea covered the noise of their movements. They collected salt water in large ceramic containers, let the next day's sun evaporate the water, and were left with precious white crystals. The air had that characteristic smell of the sea, strong and penetrating. Mixed with the sweat of physical labor, it created an atmosphere of tension and urgency. Each crystal of salt collected was a small act of rebellion, but also of survival. There's something interesting about how state monopolies, created theoretically to generate revenue for the state, often ended up creating economic opportunities for those willing to take risks. The more the state tried to control, the more incentives it created for people to find ways around that control. And it wasn't just about taxes and monopolies, there was also pure and simple scarcity, unequal distribution of resources. Think of ancient Mesopotamia, civilization born between two rivers, but much of the surrounding territory was arid. Wood was scarce, there weren't large forests like in Europe. So wood was an extremely valuable resource necessary for construction, for tools, for fuel. The state controlled official timber imports, mainly cedar from Lebanon. But demand was greater than official supply, and prices were prohibitive for common people. So alternative routes developed. Small merchants who brought wood from other regions without going through official channels. Was it lower quality wood than official cedar? Often yes, but it was accessible. It's what allowed a common carpenter to work, a family to repair their house, or think of metals. Copper, tin, iron. Essential for tools, for weapons, for countless everyday uses. The distribution of these resources was extremely unequal, geographically. Some regions had them, others didn't, and official trade, with all its fees and regulations, made these metals inaccessible to many. So illegal foundries emerged, small operations where metal was worked outside state control. Blacksmiths who recycled broken tools, who bought metal scrap from unofficial sources, who created an entire parallel market for metal products. And you, what do you think of this? Leave your opinion in the comments when you have a moment. Now let's talk about another crucial factor, social stratification. The shadow economy offered one of the few avenues for social mobility in the ancient world. If you were born into the lower class in most ancient societies, your chances of moving up socially were practically zero. The system was rigid. You did what your father did and your son would do what you do. End of story. But the parallel market? There the rules were different. There what mattered wasn't your surname or your lineage. It was your cunning, your courage, your ability to build networks of trust, a freed slave, for example. In official society, he carried the stigma of having been a slave. There were legal limitations on what he could do, where he could go. But in the shadow economy, if he was smart, if he knew how to navigate the informal networks, he could prosper in ways official society would never allow. Many of the great informal merchants came exactly from these marginalized classes, people who had nothing to lose and everything to gain, people for whom the official system offered absolutely nothing, and for women, the informal economy was sometimes the only option for economic independence. In most ancient societies, women had extremely limited economic rights. They couldn't own property, couldn't make contracts, couldn't trade officially. But informally, a widow could support the family by selling homemade products. A woman could work as an intermediary in negotiations, using her network of social contacts in ways the official economy didn't recognize, but that created real value. In the streets of Alexandria, when the sun began to set and shadows grew longer, you'd see these women. Moving between houses, carrying covered baskets, making discreet exchanges, they were practically invisible to official records, but absolutely essential to the city's real economy. There are parallels with today, aren't there? How many people work in the informal economy because the formal system excludes them? How many find in informality the only chance to survive and, who knows, prosper a little? So when we look at the ancient shadow economy, we can't look with simplistic moral judgment. It wasn't about bad people wanting to cheat the system. It was about people trying to live in a world where the official system often worked against them. It was about a farmer trying to feed his family when taxation was crushing, about a craftsman trying to get the raw materials he needed when state monopolies made everything inaccessible, about a widow trying to survive when official society offered her no legitimate path. It was about resilience, about human creativity in the face of adversity, about finding ways to flourish or at least survive even when circumstances conspired against you. And maybe that's why these parallel economies were so persistent, so impossible to completely eliminate. Because they weren't aberrations, they were natural responses to systems that, however impressive in terms of organization and power, failed to meet the basic needs of much of the population. Ancient states built magnificent monuments, pyramids, aqueducts, roads. But for the common person, what mattered was, can I feed my family today? Can I get the salt I need? Can I trade my work for something I value? And when the official answer to these questions was no, or yes, but at an impossible cost, then people found their own answers, in the shadows, in the spaces between the rules, in the informal networks of trust and exchange. It was in these cracks that real life happened, and it was there that the most interesting stories were born, the most ingenious solutions, the most complex and fascinating networks. White gold, the secret salt trade. Let's talk now about one of the most smuggled commodities in ancient history, salt. It might seem strange to think of salt as something valuable, right? Today we buy a package of salt at the supermarket for almost nothing. But in the ancient world, salt was precious, was literally vital. Without refrigeration, how did you preserve meat? How did you keep fish edible for more than a few days? How did you cure leather? How did you treat certain diseases? The answer to all these questions was salt. It wasn't luxury, it was absolute necessity, and precisely because of this, many ancient governments saw salt as a perfect opportunity for taxation. Something everyone needed, but that wasn't so easy to produce or obtain everywhere. The salt monopoly became one of the most common fiscal tools in ancient civilizations. In China, during various dynasties, salt was an imperial monopoly. The logic was simple. If everyone needs salt and only the empire can legally sell salt, then the empire has a guaranteed source of revenue. But reality was more complicated. Imagine the vast salt flats along the Chinese coast. Under the scorching summer sun, seawater was collected in huge, shallow tanks. The intense heat slowly evaporated the water, leaving behind white crystals that gleamed like snow under the bright light. The smell was strong. That characteristic aroma of the sea, concentrated, mixed with the odor of dried algae and the sweat of workers under the relentless sun. The air shimmered with the heat, creating mirages that danced on the horizon. Officially, these operations were state-controlled. Workers were registered, production was accounted for, taxes were collected even before the salt reached the market. The final price, when salt reached the common consumer in the interior, could be 10–15 times higher than the production cost. So what happened? Groups of people began to operate their own salt pans, in secret. At night, when official inspectors weren't around, they collected salt water. During the day, in hidden locations, they let the sun do its work. It was dangerous. If caught, punishments were severe. But potential profits were enormous, and it wasn't just about producing salt illegally. There was an entire clandestine transportation network. Salt needed to be moved from production areas to consumers in the interior. There were official checkpoints on main roads where cargo was inspected, so smugglers used alternative routes, trails through mountains, paths along rivers using small boats that traveled at night, passages through dense forests where inspectors rarely ventured. It was complex logistics requiring careful planning and networks of trust. Think of the scene, a small caravan, maybe 5 or 6 people, moving through a bamboo forest by moonlight. The sound of wind making bamboo leaves whisper creates a curtain of noise that masks their footsteps. Each person carries bags of thick cloth, heavy with salt. Moonlight filters through the tree canopy, creating patterns of light and shadow that constantly move. It's beautiful, in a strange way. There's a peace in that moment, despite the danger. The humid smell of the forest, wet earth and vegetation contrasts with the salty odor of the cargo they transport. They know exactly where the official checkpoints are. Generations of knowledge passed from father to son, from mentor to apprentice. This knowledge isn't on any official map. It's in stories, in the collective memory of these smuggling communities. In the Roman Empire, the situation was a bit different, but equally fascinating. The Romans built elaborate roads, partly to facilitate army movement, but also for trade. And one of the important commodities was salt. There was the Via Salaria, the salt road, which connected the salt pans on the Adriatic Sea coast with Rome. The name itself shows the importance of salt in the economy. But here's the interesting thing, even with official roads and regulated trade, there was still significant smuggling. Why? Because of the fees. Moving salt along the Via Salaria meant passing through several toll posts. Each city along the way wanted its share. In the end, these fees could double or triple the price of salt. So merchants found alternative routes. Sometimes they used small boats along the coast, disembarking at smaller ports where inspection was looser. Sometimes they used secondary roads, less monitored. And sometimes they simply bribed toll collectors to register smaller loads than they actually transported. There's something almost romantic about it, isn't there? This idea of ordinary people using ingenuity and courage to circumvent systems they saw as unjust. But it's important to remember that it wasn't adventure, it was necessity disguised as boldness. And what do you think of this? Leave your opinion in the comments when you have a moment. In ancient Egypt, salt was also crucial, mainly for the mummification process, but also for food preservation. The desert provided salt in abundance, but as always, the state wanted to control its distribution. There were specific regions where salt could be legally collected upon payment of appropriate fees. But the desert is vast and inspection was impossible everywhere. So nomadic groups, Bedouins who knew the desert like no one else, collected salt freely. They knew where to find the best deposits, salt lakes that dried in summer, leaving thick crusts of pure salt. Natural deposits hidden in wadis, dry valleys where water occasionally flowed. This knowledge was power, and they used this power to create their own parallel trade. At night, under the incredibly bright stars of the desert, camel caravans moved silently through the dunes. The soft creaking of leather saddles, the muffled sound of hooves on soft sand, the occasional grunt of a camel. It was a silent symphony of clandestine commerce. The desert night air is cold, surprisingly cold after the scorching heat of the day. The contrast is so intense you can see your breath form small clouds of vapor. And that characteristic smell of the desert at night, a mixture of dry sand, rare plants that bloom only after the sun sets, and the distant odor of campfires. These caravans avoided official trade routes. They knew paths through the desert that didn't appear on maps, secret oases where they could rest and replenish water, networks of contacts in villages and cities that would buy their salt, no questions asked, at better prices than official ones for both sellers and buyers. And here's something fascinating. In many cases, authorities knew about these networks. They weren't blind, but there was a pragmatic calculation happening. Trying to completely eliminate salt smuggling would be extremely difficult, would require enormous resources, and could cause social instability. Because if official salt became inaccessible or absurdly expensive, people would suffer. And suffering people tend to revolt. So in practice, there was tacit tolerance. As long as smuggling didn't get too brazen, as long as official networks still functioned and generated revenue, the authorities' eyes could, selectively, not see certain things. It was a delicate balance, a constant dance between enforcement and tolerance. And this created an entire complex economic ecology where official and parallel markets coexisted, sometimes even complementing each other. Think about it. A large official salt merchant could secretly also be involved in parallel networks. Why? Because if there were disruption in official supply for any reason, he'd still have access to the product through informal channels. It was a kind of insurance. And small merchants who couldn't compete in the official market due to high entry costs found their niche in the parallel market. They sold to local communities, built relationships of trust, became essential to the daily economy of villages and neighborhoods. Doesn't this still happen today? Official and informal economies intertwining in ways we don't always perceive. Another interesting aspect of salt smuggling was the innovation it generated. When you need to hide salt, need to transport it secretly, you start thinking creatively. Some smugglers dissolved salt in water and transported the brine in common amphorae, labeled as containing wine or oil. Later, at the destination, they evaporated the water again to recover the salt. It was laborious, but it worked. Others developed compression techniques, creating dense blocks of salt that took up less space and were easier to hide. These blocks could be disguised as building stones or other innocent materials. There was also the practice of mixing salt with other goods. For example, a grain cargo could have salt hidden in secret compartments, or salt could be ground fine and mixed with spices, creating mixtures that were harder to identify and tax appropriately. Each of these innovations represented ordinary people applying creativity to real problems. And many of these techniques, developed by smugglers, were eventually adopted by legitimate merchants once regulations changed or routes opened up. So smuggling wasn't just an alternative to official trade. It was, in a way, an innovation laboratory, a place where new ideas could be tested far from the conservative eyes of authorities. And maybe that's one of the most interesting lessons of this story, that sometimes it's in the margins, in the unregulated spaces, that the most genuine innovation happens. When there's necessity, when there's pressure, when the official path is blocked, human creativity finds other ways. Salt, so simple, so common to us today, tells a much larger story, a story about value, about control, about resistance, about how something essential for life can become a tool of power, and about how ordinary people, facing that power, find ways to survive and sometimes even prosper. But salt was just one of the commodities that flowed through these invisible networks. There were others equally fascinating, each with its own stories, its own routes, its own methods of transport and concealment. And one of the most fascinating was silk, a fabric so precious that entire empires organized themselves around its trade. Silk webs, the most coveted fabric of the ancient world. If salt was white gold, silk was simply liquid gold in fabric form. No other commodity captured the imagination and desire of ancient elites like silk. Soft to the touch, shining in the light, light as a summer breeze. It was a material that seemed almost magical to those who didn't know its production process. And the most fascinating part? For centuries, the secret of how to make silk remained exclusively with the Chinese. They guarded this knowledge with almost religious zeal. Revealing the secrets of silk production was a crime punishable by death. And this exclusivity made silk even more valuable, even more desired in distant lands. Imagine Rome at its height. Senators in white togas, wealthy matrons adorned with jewels. But the real status symbol, a cloak of pure silk, dyed with Tyrian purple. The combination of these two rarities, silk from China, purple from the Mediterranean, could cost more than an entire villa. The touch of silk was unmistakable. If you've never felt real silk against your skin, it's hard to describe. It's smooth, but not slippery, like modern satin. It's cool to the initial touch, then warms with body heat. It has a light weight, almost non-existent, but at the same time, a presence, a quality you feel when the fabric moves. and the shine. Oh, the shine of silk under candlelight at a Roman banquet, as if the fabric captured the light and returned it amplified, creating a play of reflections that changed with every movement. It was hypnotic. It was wearable art. But this luxury came from far away, through one of the most extraordinary trade routes in history, the Silk Road. Actually, it wasn't a single route, but a complex network of paths connecting China to the Mediterranean, passing through brutal deserts, impossible mountains, and countless political borders. The journey could take years. Silk passed through dozens of intermediaries, each adding their margin, each border charging their fees. In the end, when silk finally reached Rome, its price was astronomical, so high that there were moments when Roman emperors tried to prohibit its use, worried about the amount of gold flowing out of the empire in exchange for fabric. But prohibitions never work when demand is high enough. They just push trade into less official channels. And that's where our story gets interesting, because beyond the official Silk Road, with its registered caravans and paid taxes, there existed a parallel Silk Road. Networks of merchants who moved the precious fabric through alternative routes, avoiding the heaviest customs posts, circumventing the strictest regulations. These parallel routes often followed more dangerous paths. They crossed parts of the Gobi Desert that official caravans avoided. They passed through gorges in the Pamir Mountains where a snowstorm could mean certain death. But risk had its price, literally. Avoiding official fees meant much higher profit margins. Stay with me until the end, because what comes next is a fascinating part of this journey. At night, in the Taklamakan Desert, a small caravan makes its way between dunes that look like frozen waves of sand. The sky is covered with stars, so numerous it seems impossible there's so much space between them. The Milky Way stretches like a river of light across the black sky. The night air is freezing. You can see your breath condensing in small clouds. The camels advance with their characteristic gait, swaying, almost meditative. The sound of their hooves on sand is whispering, soft. From time to time, one of them coughs or grunts, and the sound carries far in the vast silence of the desert. The men of the caravan are wrapped in layers of wool and felt against the cold. Their faces are covered with scarves, protecting against the wind that carries fine sand. They speak little, not for fear of being heard. There's no one to hear for miles. But because the desert imposes a kind of reverent silence, it's too big, too old, too indifferent for trivial conversations. In the leather bags the camels carry, wrapped in felt and linen, are rolls of silk. Not many. Silk is light but bulky, and they can't carry as much as they'd like. But each roll is worth a small fortune. Enough to transform a man's life if he manages to reach his destination. They avoided the main oasis where they know officials check caravans. Instead, they're heading to a smaller oasis, known only to those who've made this journey for generations. There, they'll meet merchants from another group who'll take the silk further through the next stage of the journey. This relay system was how many long-distance smuggling operations worked. No one made the complete journey. It was safer, more efficient, and harder to trace. If a caravan were intercepted, it only had part of the merchandise, and the carriers could honestly say they didn't know where it came from or where it was going beyond the next stage. Now let's talk about spices, because along with silk, and sometimes mixed with it as a way to hide both commodities, traveled the most valuable spices of the ancient world. Black pepper from the Malabar coast in India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, cloves from the remote islands of what is now Indonesia, cardamom, ginger, nutmeg. Each of these spices was rare, valuable, and essential not just for cooking, but also for medicine and religious rituals. The smell of a spice cargo was intoxicating, a complex mixture of aromas that varied depending on which spices were present. Pepper had that pungent odor, almost making you sneeze just from smelling it. Cinnamon, sweet and warm. Cloves, intense and penetrating. Cardamom, with its citrus and mint notes. When a caravan loaded with spices passed, even several dozen meters away, you knew. The air became perfumed. It was impossible to hide completely. And this created an interesting problem for smugglers: how to hide something you can smell from far away. The solution? Mix with other aromas, transport spices along with loads of tanned leather, whose strong smell masked the more subtle aromas. Or pack in layers of sealed beeswax, which blocked the odor until opened at the destination. Or more boldly, hide small quantities of valuable spices inside large loads of more common and less taxed spices. For example, you could declare you were transporting cumin, a common and relatively cheap spice. But hidden in the middle of the cumin load, in small sealed packages, was black pepper or saffron, much more valuable. An inspector would have to go through the entire load to find it, and even then might not distinguish between different spices at first glance. There was also the technique of deliberate adulteration as a form of concealment. Mixing real pepper with fake pepper, seeds from other plants that looked similar, not only increased the apparent volume of the merchandise, but also confused inspectors about the real value of the cargo. It was a constant cat-and-mouse game. Authorities developed more sophisticated inspection methods. Smugglers responded with more ingenious concealment methods. And so the dance continued generation after generation. How do you think it would be to participate in this? To have your livelihood depend on deceiving inspectors, on knowing secret routes, on building networks of trust in distant places where you don't even speak the local language? There's a fascinating story about silk that illustrates these dynamics well. It's said that eventually the secret of silk production leaked from China. How? Through smuggling, of course. But not smuggling of silkworm eggs and mulberry seeds. The most famous legend involves two monks who, in the 6th century, smuggled silkworm eggs hidden inside their hollow bamboo walking sticks. They took these eggs, along with knowledge about how to raise the worms and process silk, to the Byzantine Empire. Truth or embellished legend? Probably a bit of both. But the fact is that eventually silk production spread. Persia and later Byzantium began producing their own silk. The Chinese monopoly was broken, and this completely changed the dynamics of the silk trade. Now there were multiple sources. Now the routes were more complex, more competitive. And ironically, this may have made smuggling even more common, because with multiple sources and multiple markets, there were more opportunities for arbitrage, more incentives to move goods outside official channels. Think of the parallel with today. When you break a monopoly, whether of knowledge or product, does it eliminate parallel markets or make them more complex? History suggests it's often the second option. Maritime routes were also crucial for the silk and spice trade. Ships that departed from ports in southern China sailed along the Southeast Asian coasts, crossed the Indian Ocean, and arrived at ports in the Red Sea or Persian Gulf. These voyages were long and dangerous. Monsoons determined when you could travel. Pirates were a constant threat. Storms could appear from nowhere, sinking ships and their precious cargo. But potential profits were so great that merchants kept risking it, and naturally there was maritime smuggling too. Ships that officially transported one cargo but secretly carried another. Hidden compartments at the bottom of holds. Cargo declared as one type of merchandise but which was actually another, much more valuable. Inspectors at ports did their best, but it was impossible to check everything. A large ship could have dozens of tons of cargo. Check each amphora, each bag, each box. It would take days. So checks were sampling, partial, and experienced merchants knew this and planned accordingly. They placed smuggled goods in the middle of the cargo, not at the top or bottom where it was more likely to be checked. They labeled ambiguously. They used multiple intermediaries, so the ship's captain could honestly say he didn't know exactly everything he was transporting. It was a sophistication that rivaled any modern commercial operation. In fact, much of what we know about logistics and risk management today has roots in these ancient practices. And here's something to reflect on. These merchants, official or parallel, were connecting cultures, spreading ideas, mixing technologies. The Silk Road didn't just transport silk, it transported religions. Buddhism spread from India to China, partly through these routes. It transported technologies, papermaking, gunpowder. It transported art, music, philosophy. So in a way, parallel economies weren't just about profit. They were, unintentionally perhaps, but still truly, about connecting humanity, about creating bridges between different worlds. And maybe that's why they could never be completely suppressed, because they served a function that went beyond the economic. They were veins of connection in a world that otherwise would remain fragmented into isolated empires and separate cultures. Precious metals, the weight of hidden wealth. If silk was luxury for the eyes and touch, precious metals were wealth in its purest and most concentrated form. Gold, silver, bronze, each had its role in the ancient economy, and each had its own parallel routes, its own concealment methods, its own smuggling stories. Gold has always exerted an almost hypnotic fascination on humanity. Its shine doesn't wear away with time. It doesn't rust, doesn't corrode. It's malleable, easy to work, but at the same time durable. It's heavy in the hands, giving a sensation of solidity, of permanence. Holding gold is holding something that seemed eternal. In the ancient world, gold was more than just precious metal. It was the very definition of value. Coins were minted in gold. Temples were decorated with gold leaf. Kings and queens adorned themselves with gold. But gold was also rigidly controlled by states. In most ancient empires, gold mines belonged to the state. Extraction was monitored. The metal had to pass through official mints where it was taxed, weighed, recorded. Each ingot had marks identifying its origin and purity. It was an elaborate control system, but, as always, where there's control, there's also resistance. And where there's concentrated value, there's incentive to circumvent control. Imagine a small mining operation in what is now Spain during Roman rule. Officially, all gold mines in Hispania belonged to the empire. Miners worked under strict supervision. The extracted gold was carefully weighed and sent for official processing, but think of the practical reality. You're at the bottom of a dark mine, lit only by oil lamps that create dancing shadows on rock walls. The air is humid and heavy, smelling of earth and sweat. The sound of pickaxes hitting stone echoes constantly, creating an irregular percussion that never stops. You find a gold vein. You see the shiny metal appearing in the dark rock. It's a moment of excitement always, no matter how many times it happens. And while extracting, a question crosses your mind. If I kept just a little piece, would anyone notice? It was impossible to supervise every moment of every miner, so small quantities of gold were diverted, a little here, a little there, hidden in creative places, inside shoes, sewn into clothes, swallowed even. Extreme method, but it happened. Over time, these small quantities accumulated and then they needed to be sold, transformed into something useful. But how to sell unregistered gold? Couldn't simply take it to the official mint. They'd ask questions. Where did it come from? Why doesn't it have the appropriate marks? So parallel networks developed. Goldsmiths who worked outside the official system, who took raw gold, melted it, transformed it into jewelry or other objects, or who simply bought the gold asking no questions and then resold it through their own networks. The sound of a small clandestine foundry was characteristic. The constant blowing of bellows keeping flames hot enough to melt metal, the hissing when liquid metal was poured into molds, the acrid smell of smoke and heated metal which stuck to clothes and skin. These operations usually happened at night in less monitored parts of cities. Underground sometimes. Or in workshops that officially produced other things, tools for example, but that secretly also worked with precious metals. Silver had similar dynamics, but with some important differences. Silver was more common than gold, but still valuable. And it was the main metal for coin minting in most empires. This created specific opportunities for smuggling and fraud. A common practice was coin adulteration. Take pure silver coins, melt them, mix with cheaper metals like copper or lead, and then remint. Externally, the coins looked identical, but they had less real silver, and the saved metal could be sold separately. States tried to combat this with various techniques: strict standards of weight and purity, severe punishments for counterfeiters, but it was a constant battle because economic incentives were very strong. If you could adulterate coins without being caught, profits were substantial. There was also direct smuggling of raw silver. Silver mines, like the famous Laurian mines in Greece, were sources of enormous wealth, but they were also points of strict control. All extracted ore should be registered and taxed. Still, silver ores found ways out of official routes. Sometimes it was a matter of bribery, paying guards to not see certain loads. Sometimes it was more elaborate, involving alternative transport routes, false documentation, networks of intermediaries. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, had its own importance. It was the metal of tools, of weapons, before iron became dominant, of everyday utensils. And here's the interesting thing. Making bronze required access to two different metals which weren't always found in the same regions. Copper was relatively common, but tin much rarer. Some of the main sources of tin in the ancient world were Cornwall in Britain and parts of the Iberian Peninsula. This meant tin needed to travel long distances to reach bronze production centres, and naturally, this long-distance trade created opportunities for parallel operations. Small merchants who moved tin outside official channels, avoiding fees, records, controls. There's something fascinating about how ancient metallurgy was actually a deeply international activity. You could have copper from Cyprus mines, tin from Cornwall, and both being smelted together in a workshop in Athens. It was globalization before the word existed, and this international nature made control even more difficult. Materials crossed multiple borders, passed through multiple jurisdictions. Each border had its own regulations, its own tax collectors. Navigating all this legally was complicated and expensive. Circumventing, risky, but potentially much more profitable. Another interesting aspect was metal recycling. In the ancient world, metal was too valuable to waste. Broken tools, damaged weapons, old jewelry, all of this was melted and reused. But this recycling created an interesting grey zone. Where did the original metal come from? If you melt an old sword and transform the metal into a new tool, do you need to pay taxes on that metal again? Regulations varied, and this ambiguity created space for informal operations. There were workshops that specialized in buying old metal and recycling it. Some were perfectly legal, others operated in grey areas, asking few questions about the metal's origin, processing material that perhaps had been stolen or smuggled originally. Iron, when it began to replace bronze as the main metal for tools and weapons, brought new dynamics. Iron was more common than copper or tin, found in more places. But transforming iron ore into usable metal required much higher temperatures, more advanced technology. So knowledge about how to work iron was, in itself, valuable. And this knowledge spread through routes not always official. itinerant blacksmiths who traveled from place to place, taking their techniques. Sometimes this technology transfer was sanctioned by states, other times it wasn't. There were documented cases of states trying to prevent qualified blacksmiths from leaving their territories, worried they'd teach their techniques to rivals. But knowledge is one of the hardest things to control. Once it exists, it finds ways to spread. How do you see this? Should technical knowledge be free, or do states have the right to control technologies they consider strategic? It's a question that resonates even today, isn't it? Now let's talk about specific methods of hiding precious metals during transport. Because metals have a characteristic that makes smuggling challenging. They're heavy. You can't simply hide a lot of gold or silver without the weight becoming obvious. One technique was to distribute the weight. Instead of having a chest full of ingots, you distribute smaller ingots throughout a larger load of other products. Some coins hidden in grain sacks. A small ingot at the bottom of an oil amphora. Spread out like this, the extra weight was less noticeable. Another technique was to disguise precious metals as less valuable metals. Cover gold with a layer of lead or iron, making ingots look less valuable than they were. Of course, a careful inspection would reveal the trick, but truly, careful inspections were rare. There was also the practice of casting precious metals in unusual shapes. Instead of standard ingots, which were easily recognizable, create shapes that could pass for other things. Fishing weights made of silver. Gold stones disguised as ship ballast. Creativity applied to the problem of hiding value, and we can't forget the oldest method of all, simply burying. Along known trade routes, archaeologists have found countless hoards of coins and precious metals. Some were never recovered by their original owners. Maybe the owner died, or was captured, or simply forgot the exact location. These archaeological finds tell us something interesting. They tell us it was common enough for travelers to bury their riches temporarily, hoping to recover them later. It was a form of insurance against theft. If you were robbed on the road, thieves wouldn't find your coins because you had buried them a few miles back. But they also speak of risks. The fact that so many hoards were never recovered suggests that traveling with wealth was dangerous, very dangerous. Ancient trade routes were arteries of civilization, but they could also be dangerous places. Bandits were common in remote areas, and it wasn't just small groups of thieves. Sometimes they were organized operations, almost private armies that controlled entire stretches of roads or maritime routes. Merchants responded by traveling in larger groups, hiring guards, establishing agreements with local authorities for protection. But all this had a cost, and these costs, again, created incentives to seek alternative routes, less obvious transport methods. And here's an interesting historical irony. Some of the best guards you could hire were ex-bandits. They knew the tactics, the dangerous places, the signs of ambush. They knew because they had been on the other side. And now they sold this knowledge for protection instead of predation. Doesn't this reflect something about human nature? That the lines between legal and illegal, protector and predator, are sometimes more fluid than we'd like to admit. The trade in precious metals, then, wasn't just about moving valuable material from one place to another. It was about navigating complex networks of trust and danger, of state control and individual autonomy, of wealth and risk. It was, in many ways, the backbone of the ancient economy, both official and parallel. The network of trust, codes, signals, and the ancient dark web. Now let's explore something fascinating, how these parallel trade networks actually worked at the human level. How did strangers trust each other in transactions that couldn't be formalized? How were agreements made when there were no written contracts, courts, or any legal recourse? The answer lies in something that was simultaneously more fragile and stronger than any legal system: networks of personal trust. Think about it. In the modern world, when you buy something online, There are protection systems, seller reviews, return guarantees, ability to dispute charges. There's an entire infrastructure of institutional trust. But what if none of this existed? What if everything depended on your ability to judge another person's character, often someone you'd never seen before? In the ancient world of the parallel economy, it was exactly like this. And because of this, elaborate systems of signals, codes, and introductions developed. It was a kind of ancient dark web, but based on face-to-face interactions and orally transmitted knowledge. Let's start with something simple. How did you identify someone who participated in these parallel markets? You couldn't simply approach a stranger and ask, "Hey, do you smuggle salt?" That would be too risky. So discrete signals developed. They could be specific gestures, a particular way of greeting, touching your own shoulder in a certain way while speaking, holding a wine cup with certain fingers extended. These were small things that would seem natural to a casual observer, but that had meaning for those who knew what to look for. Sometimes the signals were verbal. Phrases that seemed like common conversations but that contained keywords. For example, in a tavern, you might say to the owner, "The path of the stars is clear tonight." A perfectly innocent phrase. But if the owner were part of the network, he'd recognize this as a signal that you were interested in doing unofficial business. He might respond to, "Yes, but watch out for clouds to the north." Also sounds like casual weather talk, right? But actually he's telling you there are extra patrols on the northern roads, so routes in that direction are riskier at the moment. It was a language within language, a code that hid in plain sight. Imagine a scene in a busy tavern in Alexandria. It's late at night, the air is heavy with the smell of wine, cooked food, and the bodies of dozens of people in an enclosed space. Smoke from oil lamps creates a soft haze that makes everything a bit blurry, a bit dreamlike. There are conversations happening in half a dozen different languages. Merchants from all over the Mediterranean mix here. Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Egyptian, sometimes more exotic languages from distant places. It's a constant buzz, punctuated by occasional laughter, the clinking of cups, the dragging of chairs. In the corner, two men talk. To any observer, it's just casual conversation between travelers. They talk about the weather, about road conditions, about market prices of common goods. But if you knew the code, you'd understand they're actually negotiating the purchase of smuggled spices. One mentions the price of wheat is high this year. He's actually saying that bribery costs have increased. The other responds, "Yes, but the harvest on my cousin's land was excellent." Translation: he has a contact who can provide what's needed at reasonable prices. The entire deal is arranged in 10 minutes of conversation that, superficially, could be about agriculture. But in the end, they know exactly what will be delivered, when, where, and for how much. If you're enjoying this journey, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories. But verbal codes were just part of the system. There were also more permanent physical signals. Marks on buildings, for example. A discrete symbol carved in a doorframe could indicate that house was a safe point, where parallel merchants could find shelter or make contacts. These marks needed to be subtle enough not to attract attention, but recognizable for those who knew what to look for. A small cross, an inverted triangle, 3 parallel lines. For most people, just random marks may be made by artisans during construction, but for initiates, an invisible map of the parallel network. Archaeologists occasionally find these marks in ancient ruins, and there are debates about their meanings. Some were clearly religious or decorative, but others? They may very well have been part of these signaling systems. Another crucial technique was the introduction system. You didn't simply show up in a new city and try to make contacts. That would be disastrous. Instead, you were introduced by someone who was already trusted in the network. It worked like this. Say you're a merchant from Antioch wanting to establish contacts in Ephesus. You know someone in Antioch who has connections in Ephesus. This intermediary gives you a letter of introduction, but it's not a common letter. It might have a specific seal made with a particular ring, or it might include a password phrase that only someone genuinely connected would know. When you arrive in Ephesus and present this letter, the person who receives it knows you're legitimate because the letter comes from someone they trust. It's a cascading trust system. I trust you because I trust the person who trusted you. And this trust wasn't given lightly. Your reputation was everything. If you betrayed a trust, if you cheated someone in the network, word would spread. And once your reputation was destroyed, you were finished. No one would do business with you anymore. This created a surprisingly effective self-regulating system. More effective sometimes than official legal systems because the consequences of breaking trust were immediate and definitive. There were also specific physical locations that served as meeting points. Taverns, as we've mentioned, were common, but not just any tavern, specific ones known in the network. The owner was usually part of the system, sometimes facilitating introductions, other times simply providing a space where people could meet without raising suspicion. Public baths were another popular location. Think of the logic. In a public bath, you're naked, literally. It's hard to hide weapons or symbols of authority, and the peculiar acoustics of Roman baths with running water and echo made it difficult for someone to eavesdrop on conversations from afar. It was a relatively safe place for sensitive discussions. Temples also served as meeting points. There was a certain protection in sacred spaces. Authorities were generally more reluctant to make arrests or inspections inside temples, and the constant movement of pilgrims and visitors provided cover. Official markets, ironically, were also locations for parallel negotiation. In the middle of the confusion and crowds, discreet conversations could happen, and the presence of so many legitimate merchants provided excellent camouflage for those who weren't so legitimate. How do you think it would be to live in this world, where every interaction had layers of meaning, where you always needed to be alert to signals, where trust was simultaneously the most valuable and riskiest thing to grant? There were also messengers, people whose function was to carry information and sometimes small goods between different nodes of the network. These messengers were carefully chosen. They needed to be reliable, discreet, and good at memorizing information because often messages weren't written. Writing something was risky. Paper or papyrus could be found, read. So important messages were often transmitted orally. The messenger memorized the message, traveled, and recited it to the recipient. Afterward, the message existed only in memory, impossible to intercept physically. Some messengers developed elaborate mnemonic techniques to remember long and complex messages, and many were multilingual, capable of operating in different regions and between different cultural groups. The movement of these messengers created the veins of the network. They kept different parts connected, allowed information to flow, which routes were safe, which authorities were being more rigorous, where there were opportunities, where there were dangers. This distributed intelligence was crucial. Without it, each operator would work in the dark, without knowing the larger context. With it, the network as a whole could adapt quickly to changing conditions. And here's something fascinating. This parallel communication system didn't just transport information about trade. It transported all kinds of information that official power would prefer to control. Political news, rumors about army movements, information about bad harvests that could affect prices. In some historical moments, these informal information networks were faster and more accurate than official communication systems. Because they had strong incentives for accuracy, business decisions depended on it, and less bureaucracy to go through, so these networks weren't just about smuggling goods. They were, in a way, parallel communication systems, ancient social networks, structures that connected people through different lines than official ones. There were periodic meetings, something like network conferences. They weren't publicly announced, of course. But at certain times of year, at certain religious festivals that attracted crowds from everywhere, network members knew to meet at specific locations. These meetings allowed making face-to-face connections, building relationships, sharing information about conditions in different regions. And because they happened during legitimate festivals, the presence of so many travelers didn't raise suspicion. The sound of one of these festivals was unique. Music playing from multiple directions, street vendors shouting their offers, laughter, conversations in dozens of languages, animals being sacrificed at temples, processions with chanting. In the middle of all this sensory chaos, business conversations happened, deals were closed, alliances formed. The smell was also characteristic. Incense burning on altars, mixed with the aroma of food being cooked in hundreds of stalls, the odor of crowds in tight spaces, occasionally the expensive perfume of some rich merchant passing by. Aren't there parallels with how digital networks work today? Communities that form around shared interests, developing their own languages and codes, creating spaces of trust outside official structures? What kept these networks functioning in the end wasn't so much the codes or signals. It was the mutual recognition that everyone was in the same boat, that they depended on each other, that betrayal would harm not just the betrayed, but potentially the entire network. It was a form of community, strange perhaps, but real, united not by geography or ethnicity or official religion, but by shared necessity and mutual trust. It was a brotherhood of shadows, connecting people across continents and cultures. And this invisible network, woven of trust and necessity, was as essential to the functioning of the ancient world as official roads or imperial armies. Maybe even more so because while empires rose and fell, these networks continued adapting, persisting, connecting. Bargains without coin, the economy of barter and favor. Now we've talked a lot about trade in valuable commodities, silk, spices, precious metals. But there was another dimension of the shadow economy that was, in a way, even more fundamental. A dimension that didn't involve coins or even high-value commodities. It was based on something more basic, direct exchange, barter. Exchange of goods for goods, services for products, work for food. It was the oldest form of economy, predating the invention of money. And in the ancient world, it continued to be absolutely vital, especially for the lower classes, and in parallel economies. Why? Because barter was invisible to taxation. How do you tax an exchange where no money changes hands? A farmer exchanges wheat for a blacksmith's services. The blacksmith repairs his tools in exchange for some sacks of grain. No coin was involved, no record was made. For the official taxation system, it's as if the transaction never happened. This made barter extremely attractive to anyone wanting to avoid taxes or operating outside the official system. And in practice, a huge portion of the ancient daily economy functioned this way. Imagine a small village in Gaul during the Roman period. It's autumn, the harvest season just passed. The surrounding fields are golden with the remains of wheat plants, swaying gently in the cool wind. The air has that characteristic autumn smell, damp earth, leaves beginning to dry, smoke from fires where people burn harvest remains. The village is small, maybe 50 families. Everyone knows everyone. And in this community, most economic exchanges happen through barter and mutual favors, not through currency. The baker exchanges bread with the dairyman for milk and cheese. The blacksmith repairs tools in exchange for grains, meat, wool, whatever people can offer. The weaver exchanges fabrics for food. The carpenter builds and repairs in exchange for everything he needs. It's a complex web of intertwined exchanges. And here's something interesting. These exchanges weren't always immediate or equivalent. There was complex mental accounting happening. You gave me help with the harvest last year, so now I help you fix your roof. You took care of my children when I needed to travel, so now I share my hunt with you. It was an economy of debts and social obligations, but it worked. In fact, for these small communities, it worked better than a purely monetary economy because it created social bonds. Each exchange wasn't just an economic transaction, but also a reinforcement of relationship. This doesn't mean it was an idyllic paradise. There were power imbalances, wealthier families had more to trade and could negotiate better terms. Conflicts arose over the relative value of different products and services. But still the system worked generation after generation. Now let's think about how this applied to larger urban centers. Because barter wasn't just a rural phenomenon. In cities, too, especially among the lower classes, direct exchanges were common. In Rome, for example, there was an entire economic underworld in the insulae, the apartment buildings where most of the population lived. In these cramped spaces where families lived in small rooms, sharing courtyards and water sources, an informal economy flourished. A woman who knew how to sew repaired clothes for neighbors in exchange for other services. Someone with access to better water sources, maybe worked near an aqueduct, could bring extra water and trade it for food. Older children took care of younger children while parents worked, and this help would be repaid in other ways. The sound of an insula at nightfall was unique. The echo of footsteps on stone staircases, conversations leaking through thin walls in multiple languages, because these dwellings were incredibly diverse. The crying of babies, laughter of children playing in courtyards, the creaking of old wood, dripping water, the occasional shout of a street vendor still making his rounds. And through this sonic chaos, constant negotiations. Can I borrow some olive oil? I'll return it tomorrow with interest. Help carry water today and I'll watch your child tomorrow. These were micro-negotiations happening hundreds of times a day, creating an economic web that no official record captured. There was also the practice of long-distance barter. This was more sophisticated and usually involved merchants specialized in facilitating exchanges without using currency. For example, a merchant could accept wool from a shepherd in one region, travel hundreds of kilometers, trade that wool for ceramics in another region, then trade the ceramics for metal in a third region, and eventually return to the starting point with goods that the original shepherd valued more than the wool he had offered. It was a barter chain where each individual transaction didn't involve money, but in aggregate created value through geographic arbitrage. The merchant profited because he knew the differences in relative prices between regions. In one place, wool was abundant and cheap. In another, it was rare and valuable. The merchant simply took advantage of these differences. And because these transactions didn't involve currency, they were much harder to tax or regulate. How would a tax collector assess an exchange of wool for ceramics? What was the real value? It was highly subjective and dependent on local context. This ambiguity was a feature, not a bug. It provided flexibility and protection against excessive taxation. Curious, isn't it? Leave in the comments what you think about this. Now let's talk about the favor economy. Something related to barter, but even more ethereal and difficult to quantify. Favors aren't exactly exchanges of goods or services in the formal sense. They're more subtle. I can introduce you to someone who can help you. Let me speak well of you to this influential person. I'll let you know if I hear of an opportunity. These favors don't have a fixed price. Their value is contextual and relational, and creating a network of people who owe you favors was, in many ways, more valuable than accumulating gold. In ancient Rome, this was formalized in the patronage system. Wealthy patricians had poor clients who depended on them. The patron provided protection, opportunities, sometimes food. In exchange, the client offered political support, physical presence, swelling crowds at public events, loyalty. It wasn't exactly slavery, but it also wasn't total freedom. It was a relationship of mutual obligation, though clearly unbalanced in terms of power. But here's the interesting thing. These patronage networks operated parallel to the official economic system. Wealth flowed through them in ways that didn't appear in any tax records. Favors were exchanged, obligations created and fulfilled, all invisible to fiscal authority. And it wasn't just in Rome. Practically every ancient society had some version of this. In China, the concept of guanxi, networks of relationships and mutual obligations. In the Arab world, wasta, influence and connections. These were parallel systems of value and exchange that existed alongside the official monetary economy. How do you think trust worked in these systems? When you do someone a favor, there's no contract guaranteeing they'll reciprocate. It's based purely on social expectation and reputation. But surprisingly, it worked. People returned favors because they knew their social position depended on it. There were also forms of barter that today we'd call time-sharing or collaborative economy. For example, expensive tools that an individual family couldn't buy were shared among several families. An ox for ploughing, for example, expensive animal to buy and maintain, but essential for agriculture. So several families could jointly own an ox, or more commonly, a family that had an ox would lend it to others in exchange for a portion of the harvest or other services. Expensive agricultural implements, metal ploughs, quality sickles, circulated through communities. You used it for a few days, then passed it to the next. At the end of the season, maybe you reciprocated with part of your harvest or with work, or simply with the expectation that when you needed something, others would also share. It was a form of community insurance. No individual needed to have everything. And this sharing created interdependence that strengthened social bonds. The smell of a rural community working collectively on the harvest had something special. Sweat mixed with the sweet aroma of ripe wheat being cut, dust suspended in the air from constant activity. The occasional smell of food being prepared to feed the workers. And underlying everything, that aroma of fertile earth, of life growing and being harvested. There was a rhythm to shared work. The sound of sickles cutting, an almost musical rhythm. Conversations and songs helping to keep time. Occasional laughter when someone made a joke. It wasn't just work. It was social ritual, community event, economy, and culture intertwined indistinguishably. This type of collaborative economy was invisible to official records, but was the real foundation of survival for countless communities. There was an aspect of resistance in this too. Each exchange made outside the official monetary system was a small act of autonomy. Not exactly rebellion, but affirmation that there were other ways to create and exchange value beyond those sanctioned by the state. And here's something to reflect on. Have we lost much of this in modernity? Is our economy so monetized, so formalized, that we've forgotten how to create value through direct exchanges and reciprocity relationships? Of course, there are disadvantages too. Barter-based economies are less efficient than monetary economies in many aspects. It's harder to save value. You can store coins, but you can't store services. It's harder to make exchanges with strangers when there's no universal medium of exchange. But there was something in these parallel barter economies that pure monetary economy missed. A human, relational dimension. Each exchange was also a human encounter, not just a transaction. And maybe that's why, even when monetary economies developed and became sophisticated, these practices of barter and favor never completely disappeared. They continued existing in the margins, in the spaces between the official economy, in the networks of people who depended more on mutual trust than on minted coins. They were the invisible glue that kept societies functioning, especially for those who didn't have full access to the official monetary economy. And they were ultimately a form of peaceful resistance, a way of saying that value and exchange exist beyond what the state recognizes or controls. Taverns, the invisible offices of the parallel economy. If parallel trade networks were the veins of the shadow economy, taverns were its beating heart. They weren't just places to drink and socialize. They were the unofficial offices where deals were closed, information was exchanged, connections were made. They were, in a way, the stock exchanges of the parallel economy. But why taverns specifically? What made them so perfect for this role? First, taverns were public places, but at the same time offered certain privacy. There was constant movement of people coming and going. This movement provided camouflage. Two strangers sitting together in a tavern didn't raise suspicion the same way two strangers meeting in a private house or dark alley would. Second, taverns were places where different social classes mixed in ways that rarely happened in other contexts. A wealthy merchant could sit a few tables away from a dock worker, and this was perfectly normal. This mixing facilitated connections that would be difficult or impossible in more formally stratified environments. Third, and perhaps most important, there was alcohol. And alcohol loosens tongues. In a tavern, information flowed more freely than in sober places. Rumors, gossip, news, everything circulated through taverns. For someone wanting to know what was happening, where opportunities were, which routes were dangerous, a tavern was the place to be. Let's enter a typical tavern in a Mediterranean port city. Say Corinth, in the 2nd century AD. It's early evening, the busiest time. The first thing that hits you upon entering is the smell. A complex mixture of aromas that's immediately recognizable and, in a way, welcoming. Wine, of course, that sweet and slightly acidic smell of wine being constantly served. But also food, bread baking, fish being grilled, olive oil heated with herbs. And underlying everything, the odor of many human bodies in an enclosed space, sweat, lamp oil, damp wood from tables and benches. The sound is organized cacophony. Conversations in half a dozen different languages overlap. Greek dominating, but you hear Latin, Aramaic, maybe Egyptian. Occasionally something more exotic from merchants who've traveled from distant lands. Laughter explodes from a corner. Someone is singing, slightly off-key, a sailor's song. Ceramic cups hit against wooden tables, footsteps on the stone floor, worn by decades of traffic. Light comes from oil lamps hung on walls and in some more elaborate candelabras. They create dancing shadows that make faces look different, mysterious. Smoke from the lamps mixes with smoke from a small brazier in the corner where food is being prepared, creating a soft haze that leaves everything slightly blurred. You find a place to sit. The tables are heavy, of dark wood, stained by countless spilled wine cups over the years. The surface is rough under your hands, marked with small grooves and notches. Some seem deliberate, maybe initials or symbols left by regular customers. The tavern owner, a middle-aged Greek man with prominent belly and easy smile, approaches. His eyes, however, are sharp. He assesses you quickly. Are you local or foreign? Do you have money? Are you someone who might cause problems? All this processed in a second. Wine, he asks, and without waiting for response, is already pouring from a large amphora into a ceramic cup. The wine is dark, almost black in the faint lamplight. It's not fine wine. This is a workers' tavern, not an aristocratic residence. But it's honest, strong enough to warm you after a cold day. You observe around while drinking. Here, in this apparently chaotic space, business is happening. At the table next to you, two men talk in low voices. One is clearly a ship captain. You can tell by the way he dresses, the calloused hands, the smell of salt he carries. The other is harder to classify. Merchant, perhaps? They're discussing a cargo that needs to be moved. To anyone listening casually, it sounds like normal business talk. But if you paid closer attention, you'd notice the careful pauses, the way they check who's nearby before saying certain things. In the opposite corner, a larger group is gathered. They look like dock workers, judging by the simple clothes and developed muscles of those who carry weight all day. They're laughing loudly, but between jokes and stories, information is being exchanged. Which ships arrived today, what they were carrying, which ones made port guards uncomfortable, which inspector accepts bribes and which doesn't. This collective intelligence of dock workers was incredibly valuable. They saw everything. They knew which cargoes were incorrectly declared. They knew which captains were trustworthy and which weren't. And they shared this knowledge among themselves, creating a type of parallel information network. At a table near the back wall where light is dimmer, a woman sits alone. This is unusual enough to be notable. Respectable women generally didn't frequent taverns alone, but she's there drinking slowly, observing. Maybe she's an intermediary, someone who connects buyers and sellers, or maybe she's waiting for someone specific. Curious, isn't it? Leave in the comments what you think about this. The tavern owner's role in this ecosystem cannot be underestimated. Good tavern owners were masters of diplomacy and discretion. They knew when to intervene in discussions that were getting heated. They knew when not to see certain things, and, crucially, they knew how to connect people. Ah, you're looking for someone who can transport goods to Alexandria? Let me see. There's a captain who usually comes here on Thursdays. Come back tomorrow night and I'll introduce you. This kind of facilitation was an essential part of the service a tavern offered. And of course, good tavern owners were compensated for these services, not necessarily with direct payment, but with loyalty, with shared information, with favors that could be collected later. The owner of a well-connected tavern was a powerful figure in the community, even if he had no official title. There were also taverns known for specific specializations. One tavern might be the place where sailors gathered. Another was known as a meeting point for textile merchants. Yet another was where scribes and educated men went. This informal specialization created hubs for different types of business, and some taverns were known, discreetly, by those who needed to know, as places where less official business could be conducted. Not that there was a sign saying "smugglers welcome," but reputation spread through the appropriate networks. How did you recognize these taverns? Sometimes by subtle signs. A specific symbol on the facade. The way the owner greeted. Or simply by the type of clientele that frequented. If you saw certain people there, people you knew were involved in parallel trade, it was a good indicator. As night advances in our Corinth tavern, the atmosphere changes. More people arrive, noise increases, more wine flows. Some people are visibly drunk now, their voices louder, their movements less coordinated. But those there for business usually drink in moderation. They need to keep their minds sharp. It's an interesting line to walk. Drink enough to fit in, not to raise suspicion, but not so much as to compromise judgment. There's music now. Someone brought a lyre and is playing, not particularly skilled, but it doesn't matter. It creates an additional layer of sound that makes private conversations even harder to hear. It's convenient for those who value privacy. The food being served is simple but substantial. Grilled fish, bread with olive oil, olives, cheese. The smell of fresh fish grilling is delicious, oil crackling over hot coals. For many of the customers, this might be the best meal of the day. Taverns weren't just about drink. For workers, they were also dining halls, places for a decent meal. And there was one more crucial function taverns played. They were banks of collective memory, because much of the knowledge needed to navigate the parallel economy couldn't be written. It was too risky. So it was kept in memories, transmitted orally. And taverns were where this transmission happened. An older merchant, sitting with wine, telling stories to young listeners. Superficially, just adventure stories. But between the lines, valuable information. how he managed to get through a certain checkpoint, which routes he used, how he identified reliable contacts, which signs to look for. It was education, but disguised as entertainment. And smart young listeners caught the real lessons beneath the superficial narratives. As night gets even later, some customers begin to leave. Those with work in the morning who've drunk enough. But others remain. The tavern never really closes until very late. For some, especially those without comfortable homes to return to, the tavern is practically a second home. The owner begins to circulate with more wine amphorae, refilling cups. He knows his customers. He knows who can pay for another round and who's already at credit limit. He knows who will cause problems if they drink too much and who's quiet even drunk. There's a kind of order in this apparent chaos. Unwritten rules everyone understands. You don't steal from other customers. You don't cause problems with the guards. You pay your bills eventually. You don't betray confidences heard here. Violating these rules could get you banned not just from this tavern, but from others too. The network of tavern owners communicated. A bad reputation travelled fast. Have we lost something with the disappearance of these types of third places? Spaces that aren't work or home, but something in between. Where community forms organically, where information flows naturally. As you finally get up to leave, the cold night air hits you like a shock after the stuffy heat of the tavern. Your clothes carry the smell of smoke and wine. Your ears still buzz with noise. But you leave with more than you came with. Maybe a new contact, maybe valuable information, maybe just a better understanding of how this underground world works. The streets are quieter now. Most people have already retired. Only a few solitary figures moving in the shadows. From other taverns you still hear sounds of life, laughter, music, the murmur of conversations. And you realize that even now, late at night, the economy never really sleeps. It just changes form, moving from daytime transactions to the more discreet business of night. And taverns are the windows to this invisible world, always open, always welcoming those who know how to enter. Power and tolerance, the pragmatic game of ancient states. Until now, we've talked a lot about common people, merchants, smugglers. But what about states and authorities? Did they simply ignore all this parallel economic activity? Or was something more complex happening? The truth is fascinating and, in a way, surprising. Ancient states weren't blind. They knew perfectly well that huge portions of economic activity escaped their taxation and control systems. But instead of trying to completely eliminate these parallel economies, they often adopted a more pragmatic stance, calculated tolerance. Why? Because there was an understanding, sometimes explicit but more often implicit, that trying to completely control all economic activity would be not only impossible but also dangerous. Imagine the calculation an ancient ruler had to make. On one side, there was the natural desire to maximize tax revenues, to control what happened within their territory, to assert authority. On the other side, there was practical reality. People needed to survive. And if the official system made that impossible or extremely difficult, then people would find other ways, and desperate people are dangerous people. So this strange balance developed. The state made its laws, established its monopolies, collected its taxes. But at the same time, there was a tacit understanding that a certain amount of parallel activity would be tolerated, as long as it didn't become too brazen, as long as it didn't seriously threaten state revenues or public order. It was like a game with unwritten rules. You could sell salt without a license, as long as you did it discreetly. You could avoid some taxes as long as you weren't too flagrant. The state knew but chose not to see until you crossed an invisible line. And where exactly was that line? That varied. It depended on the ruler, the economic situation, the political climate. And part of the art of surviving in the parallel economy was having sensitivity to know where that line was at any given moment. Let's look at some specific examples of how this worked in practice. In ancient China, especially during periods of relative stability, there was a policy we can call selective blind eyes regarding salt smuggling. Salt was an imperial monopoly, yes. Officially, all salt should be traded through state channels, but in practice, local authorities often tolerated small, illegal salt operations. Why? Because people needed salt, and if official salt became inaccessible or absurdly expensive, there would be disturbances. Better to allow some leakage in the system than risk social instability. Of course, if a smuggling operation got too big, too profitable, too obvious, then it was crushed. But small operators, often left alone. There were even documented cases of local officials who secretly warned smugglers when inspections were coming. Why? Sometimes for bribes, of course, but not always. Sometimes simply because the official understood that completely eliminating the parallel salt trade would cause genuine suffering for common people, and that would eventually reflect on him too. It was pragmatism dressed as corruption, or perhaps corruption that served a pragmatic function. The line was nebulous. In the Roman Empire, there were similar attitudes. Rome had elaborate laws about trade taxation, taxes on goods entering and leaving ports, fees on market transactions, tributes on lands, a quite sophisticated fiscal system, but enforcement uneven at best. Especially far from Rome, in distant provinces, local authorities had enormous discretion over how rigorously they enforced regulations, and many chose to be selective. There was an understanding that trade, even informal trade, brought prosperity, and prosperous provinces were easier to govern. So as long as main tax revenues continued flowing to Rome, a certain amount of untaxed activity was tolerated. There's a phrase that circulated among Roman governors, something like, "It's better to tax 100 sheep each a little than to completely skin 10 sheep and have the other 90 fleeing to the mountains." The metaphor may be rustic, but the economic wisdom was solid. Ancient Egypt had a notoriously elaborate bureaucracy. Scribes recorded everything. There were tax lists, grain inventories, population censuses. It was one of the most administratively sophisticated states of the ancient world. And yet there were flourishing parallel economies. In village markets, far from the great administrative centers, transactions happened that were never recorded. Small farmers traded directly among themselves. Artisans sold products without going through official channels. Did the royal scribes know this? Of course. But there was a pragmatic calculation. Trying to record and tax every small transaction in every remote Egyptian village would be impossible. It would require a bureaucratic apparatus so massive that its costs would exceed the revenues generated. Better to focus on large transactions, valuable goods, wealthy merchants. So there was this implicit enforcement hierarchy. Large smuggling operations were vigorously pursued. Medium operations were monitored and occasionally repressed, especially if they started to significantly affect state revenues. Small operations, often ignored as long as they remained small. And here's something interesting. Sometimes states even used these parallel economies for their own purposes. For example, during wars or crises, when official provisions failed, armies often depended on parallel merchants to obtain supplies. Officially, the army should be supplied through state channels. In practice, quartermasters often bought from any available source without asking many questions about licenses or taxes. There was also the phenomenon of private tax farmers. In some periods and places, the right to collect taxes was sold or auctioned by the state to private individuals. These tax collectors then had great discretion over how to collect, and many of these private collectors developed complex relationships with parallel economies. They could agree to not see certain activities in exchange for informal payments, or they could allow certain merchants to operate with questionable documentation as long as a portion of profits flowed back. Was this corruption? Technically, yes. But it was also, in a way, how the system actually worked. It created flexibility that the rigid official system didn't have. It allowed the economy to breathe in ways that pure regulation wouldn't allow. Naturally, this also created injustices. Those with connections, with resources to bribe, had advantages. The very poor, with nothing to offer, could be treated more harshly. It wasn't a fair system, but few systems in antiquity were. There were also moments of repression. When states were under financial pressure, after expensive wars, during crises, tolerance for parallel activities decreased. Suddenly, officials who previously turned a blind eye began to enforce laws rigorously. Market raids, merchandise confiscations, arrests of known smugglers. These waves of repression served multiple purposes. Obviously, they generated immediate revenue through fines and confiscations, but they also served as reminders. We're still the authority, don't forget that. But these repressions rarely lasted long, because eventually the same pragmatic calculations reasserted themselves. Squeezing too hard caused suffering. Suffering caused instability. Instability was expensive and dangerous, so tacit tolerance gradually returned. It was a cycle. Tolerance, growth of parallel activities, occasional repression, return to tolerance. And this cycle repeated through decades and centuries. How do you see this? Was it pragmatic wisdom of ancient rulers, or simply inability to completely control their populations? Perhaps both. There were also fascinating regional differences. Some rulers were known for being more tolerant, others for being more rigid. And merchants knew this. Trade routes sometimes changed not for geographic reasons, but because a new ruler in a certain region had a reputation for being more flexible, or, inversely, more strict. It was a form of competition between jurisdictions. Regions that were too rigid could see trade diverting to more tolerant neighboring areas. And this eventually affected revenues, forcing policy changes. There are obvious modern parallels, aren't there? Countries with more favorable regulations and taxes attract business. It's an ancient dynamic, and there was one last crucial factor: enforcement capacity. Laws mean little if you can't enforce them. And in the ancient world, with slow communications, vast territories, limited bureaucracies, complete enforcement was simply impossible. An imperial decree could be issued in Rome, but take months to reach distant provinces. And even when it arrived, who guaranteed it would be enforced? The local governor had enormous practical autonomy, and he made his own calculations about what was politically wise. So these parallel economies existed not just because they were tolerated, but because they were, to a large extent, ineliminable. They were like flowing water. You could try to channel it, could build barriers, but it would always find paths around. And perhaps the wisest rulers recognized this. Recognized that their power, however impressive it seemed in monuments and decrees, had practical limits. And that working within those limits, instead of fighting against them uselessly, was simply smarter. It was a complex dance between power and resistance, authority and autonomy, control and freedom. And in this dance, both sides made concessions, found accommodations, created this grey space where real life happened. Innovation, born from shadows. When necessity creates the new, there's a fascinating paradox in ancient parallel economies. While operating outside the law, they were often sources of genuine innovation, techniques, routes, technologies. Many things that eventually became part of the official economy were born first in the shadows, developed by people who needed to solve problems the official system ignored or couldn't solve. Why? Because necessity and pressure are powerful catalysts of creativity. When you can't use conventional methods, when official doors are closed, you need to find new doors. Or make your own. Let's start with something simple but profound: trade routes. Many of the great trade routes of antiquity were discovered not by official explorers sponsored by states, but by private merchants, many operating in legal grey areas. The famous Silk Road, for example. It wasn't designed by any emperor. It wasn't planned by any state council. It emerged organically over centuries through the efforts of countless individual merchants, each exploring a bit further, finding paths through mountains and deserts, establishing relationships with different peoples, and many of these pioneers were, in official terms, smugglers. They were moving goods without appropriate authorizations, avoiding checkpoints, operating outside official regulations. But in the process, they were mapping the world, creating connections that no individual state had capacity to create alone. Think of the courage this required. You're somewhere in Central Asia, 1,000 kilometers from your home. There are no maps, there are no signs. You trust local guides who may not speak your language. You cross territories controlled by peoples who've never seen anyone from your culture before. The scenery is vast and intimidating. Mountains that seem to touch the sky, their peaks covered with snow, even in summer. Deep valleys where wind howls like a living creature. Deserts where dunes stretch to the horizon, a sea of sand under a relentlessly blue sky. At night when you camp, the silence is almost physical. So deep you hear your own heart beating. The air is thin at these altitudes, making each breath a conscious effort. The cold is penetrating, seeping through all layers of clothing, but the stars. Oh, the stars at these altitudes, far from any human light, are something breathtaking. So numerous it seems impossible there's space between them. The Milky Way like a bright river crossing the sky. And you use these stars for navigation, for orientation, when there's no other guide. These pioneers weren't just trading, they were exploring. And the knowledge they accumulated, which mountain passes were navigable, where to find water in the desert, which peoples were friendly to trade and which were hostile, this knowledge was incredibly valuable. And how did this knowledge spread? Not through official maps guarded in imperial libraries, but through informal networks. One merchant told another. Guides transmitted knowledge through generations. It was living information, constantly updated, much more dynamic than any official record. Eventually, some of these paths became official. States recognized their value, established checkpoints, tried to regulate and tax. But the initial discovery, the hard work of finding the paths, that came from the margins, from informal operators. The story is coming to an end, but what comes next is the most reflective part. Stay with me. There was also technological innovation born from the need to hide and transport goods. Let's talk about some of these packaging techniques, for example. When you need to hide valuable goods inside common cargo, you develop sophisticated methods, secret compartments in amphorae that externally look normal. Wax sealing techniques that could be opened and resealed without leaving obvious signs. Methods of packing goods so they occupied less space, allowing you to hide more. Many of these techniques were eventually adopted by legitimate merchants because they were simply more efficient. The line between hiding and packing efficiently is thin. A method developed for smuggling could become industry standard practice. There were also innovations in navigation. Maritime merchants operating outside official routes needed to be good navigators. They couldn't depend on known ports or help from naval patrols. So they developed deep expertise in reading stars, currents, wind patterns. Some of the best navigators of antiquity were those operating on the margins of legality. They needed to be. Their survival depended on it. And the knowledge they developed about navigation eventually benefited everyone. There are records of navigation techniques that appeared first in fishing and small merchant communities, many operating informally, and only decades or centuries later were adopted by official navies. Food preservation methods also saw innovation through parallel economies. When you're transporting goods over long distances without refrigeration, preservation is crucial, and merchants, especially those who couldn't count on official infrastructure, developed ingenious techniques. New methods of salting and drying, use of spices not just for flavor, but for preservation. Fermentation techniques. Many of the culinary traditions we value today have roots in these practical needs of ancient merchants. And here's something interesting. Because these merchants operated across multiple cultures, they were vehicles of technology transfer. A technique developed in India could be taken to Persia, adapted there, and then taken to the Mediterranean. It was a cross-pollination of ideas that happened much faster in informal networks than through official channels. States had rigid borders. Official cultures were often insular. But merchants? Merchants were pragmatic. If a technique worked, it didn't matter where it came from. This pragmatism facilitated diffusion of innovation. There was also financial innovation. The concept of credit, of bills of exchange, of networks of trust that allowed transferring value without physically moving coins. Many of these ideas were developed or refined in contexts of parallel trade. Why? Because moving physical currency was risky and heavy, especially for merchants operating in grey areas who couldn't necessarily resort to official protection. Finding ways to do business without moving large quantities of gold or silver was essential. So credit systems developed based purely on trust and reputation. I give you goods here, and you pay me through an associate of yours in another city. It was a sophisticated system that required extensive trust networks, but it worked. And these informal financial systems eventually influenced official banking practices. Many of the basic techniques of modern banks, transfers, credit, promissory notes, have roots in these ancient informal practices. Thinking about communication systems, informal networks were often faster and more efficient than official systems. Why? Less bureaucracy, more direct incentives. If your survival or profit depends on having fast and accurate information, you develop efficient systems. There are historical cases where information about important events, political changes, natural disasters, commercial opportunities, reached private merchants days or weeks before reaching state officials. Informal networks were simply more agile, and this speed of information created competitive advantages. Knowing before that prices would rise or fall, knowing that a certain route was blocked before others knew. This knowledge had immense value, so messenger networks developed, signal systems, even something like codes for rapid communication. And many of these communication innovations eventually influenced official systems. There was also social and organizational innovation. Informal guilds, merchant associations, mutual protection networks. Many of these structures emerged first, outside official contexts. Why? Because when you operate outside the protection of law, you need to create your own protection structures. You need ways to resolve disputes without resorting to courts. You need mechanisms to enforce agreements when there's no official authority to do so. So informal communities developed their own systems, councils of elders, respected arbitrators, codes of conduct unwritten but rigorously enforced. These were forms of governance that existed parallel to official state structures, and some of these organizational innovations eventually influenced official structures. Guilds that began informally were, in some cases, eventually recognized and incorporated into official systems. Their rules and practices became models. Does innovation always come from the margins, from places where people face real problems that the mainstream ignores? There's something in this idea that resonates through history, isn't there? Another type of innovation, linguistic and cultural. Because merchants operating across multiple cultures needed to communicate, Pidgin and Creole languages developed, mixtures of different languages that allowed basic communication between people without common language. These commercial languages were viewed with disdain by educated elites. They were impure, corrupted, but they were functional. They allowed trade to happen, and over time some of these commercial languages evolved and became complete languages, spoken by millions. The very concept of lingua franca, a common language used for trade between different groups, emerges from these contexts, and the necessity that created it came from merchants operating across borders, many in informal or parallel contexts. There was also diffusion of religious and philosophical ideas through these networks. Merchants didn't just carry goods, they carried ideas. And because parallel trade networks were often more extensive and connected than official structures, ideas could spread faster through them. Buddhism spreading from India to China, Christianity spreading through the Roman Empire, Islam spreading through trade routes. In all these cases, merchants were crucial vehicles. And many of these merchants operated in informal spaces, carrying ideas along with spices and silks. It wasn't planned, it wasn't a conscious proselytizing strategy, but it happened naturally. People in contact share more than products. They share stories, beliefs, worldviews. And maybe that's the deepest legacy of these parallel economies. Not just products moved, not just profits made, but human connections created, bridges built between different worlds, innovations born from necessity that eventually benefited everyone. Shadow economies weren't just about avoiding taxes or circumventing regulations. They were innovation laboratories, spaces where new ideas could be tested without official approval. And many things we today consider normal, part of the regular course of trade and communication, were born first in these marginal spaces. It's a reminder that innovation often comes from unexpected places, that those operating outside the mainstream, by necessity, develop solutions the mainstream eventually adopts, that the margins in a way lead. Echoes in the present. What ancient shadows teach us today? So we've reached the end of this journey through the invisible economies of the ancient world. We've traveled through night markets and caravan routes, through smoke-filled taverns and star-lit deserts. We've met farmers hiding harvests, merchants navigating secret codes, entire networks of people creating value outside the eyes of authorities. And now, as this story approaches its end, it's worth pausing to reflect. What does all this mean? Why did we dedicate these hours exploring invisible transactions from civilizations long gone? Perhaps because these stories aren't really about the past, or at least not just about the past. They're about something deeper, more permanent, about human nature, about how people respond when official systems fail to meet their needs, about resilience, creativity, and the eternal search for autonomy. Ancient parallel economies were, at bottom, about human dignity, about refusing to passively accept impossible conditions. When a farmer hid part of his harvest to avoid starvation, he wasn't just evading taxes, he was affirming something fundamental, that his life, his family's life, mattered more than the state's demands. There was something almost poetic in this quiet resistance. It wasn't revolution in the dramatic sense. There were no barricades or manifestos. But it was resistance nonetheless. Millions of small acts of autonomy accumulated over centuries, creating spaces where life could flourish despite circumstances. And are we so different today? We live in a world much more regulated, much more connected, much more monitored than any ancient civilization, but the fundamental tension remains between official rules and the realities of daily life, between what the system says we should do and what we actually need to do to survive. Informal economies still exist in practically every country in the world. In some places, they're small margins. In others, they're massive, perhaps larger than official economies. Forms have changed. Today we have digital platforms, cryptocurrencies, gig economy. But the underlying motivations, surprisingly similar to a Roman merchant avoiding customs fees or an Egyptian farmer hiding grain. People still seek ways to create and exchange value when official channels are too expensive, too slow, too exclusionary. and states still make that same ancient calculation: how much control to try to exercise, where to tolerate, where to repress. It's a humbling reminder, in a way, that for all our technological progress, certain human dynamics remain constant. The search for survival, for autonomy, for dignity, the impulse to create, exchange, connect. These things transcend specific eras. But perhaps the deepest lesson from these ancient economies is about the value of the unregulated, the informal, the spontaneous. Because it was in these spaces that much genuine innovation happened. New routes discovered, new techniques developed, new forms of organization created. There was a freedom in these marginal spaces. Freedom to experiment, to fail, to try new things without needing official approval. And this freedom was productive. It generated solutions the mainstream eventually adopted. Do we lose something when everything becomes regulated? When every activity needs a license, every transaction needs to be recorded, every innovation needs to pass through endless approvals? There's an argument for regulation, of course, protection, safety, justice, but there's also a cost in terms of agility, creativity, spontaneity. Ancient societies unintentionally created spaces for both. Official systems provided structure, order, predictability. Parallel economies provided flexibility, adaptability, innovation. And the tension between the two, however uncomfortable, was perhaps productive. Think of the trust networks we explored, systems where reputation was everything, where your word needed to be more solid than any contract, and there's something beautiful in that, isn't there? A deeply human, relational form of economy. Today we trust in institutions, in legal systems, in impersonal enforcement mechanisms, and this has clear advantages. It allows us to do business with complete strangers across enormous distances, but we also lose something, that relational quality, where each transaction was also a human encounter. Are there ways to recover this? To build systems that are efficient but also human? That have the scale and reliability of modern institutions but also the relational quality of ancient networks? It's a question worth contemplating. And there's the question of justice. Ancient parallel economies weren't egalitarian paradises. There was exploitation, there were power imbalances. The clever, the connected, those with resources had advantages. The vulnerable could be harmed. But they also offered opportunities for some whom the official system excluded completely. Women who couldn't officially own property but could trade informally. Freed slaves who carried social stigmas but could prosper on the margins. Conquered peoples who lost political autonomy but maintained economic autonomy through informal networks. It was imperfect, deeply imperfect. But it was also, for many, the only available option. And recognizing this isn't romanticizing. It's simply seeing clearly the complexity of human experience. What a journey, right? If you enjoyed traveling with us, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. And if you have any reflections, share them in the comments. As night advances, and if you're still with me, we've been together for hours, there's a certain peace in contemplating these ancient stories. There's something comforting in realizing that the challenges we face aren't new, that people long before us faced similar tensions and found ways to navigate them. Not because we have all the answers, but because there's comfort in continuity, in being part of a human story much larger than our individual lives. That farmer in Galilee hiding grain before collectors arrived. That merchant in Alexandria weaving her network of informal contacts. That navigator crossing the Indian Ocean with undeclared cargo. They were real people with real lives, real loves, real fears. And their choices, their struggles echo to us, not because they're identical to ours, but because they're recognizable. Because they touch something fundamental about what it means to be human. Seeking meaning, seeking sustenance, seeking connection. Trying to create good life for ourselves and those we love within circumstances we don't always control. And maybe that's what parallel economies, ancient or modern, really represent. Not just economic strategies, but affirmations of humanity. Refusals to be reduced to numbers in bureaucratic systems, insistences that we're agents, not just objects, that we can create, exchange, connect, innovate, even when, especially when, official structures say we can't. It's a lesson in humility for those with power. That absolute control is illusion, that people will always find paths around systems that don't serve their needs, and that perhaps, just perhaps, this isn't something to be feared or suppressed, but something to be understood and within reason accommodated. And it's a lesson in hope for those without power, that even when it seems there are no options, human creativity finds ways. That resistance doesn't need to be dramatic to be effective. That small acts of autonomy multiplied by millions change the world. As this story ends, imagine for a moment all those invisible networks we wove about. Caravan routes crossing deserts under starry sky. Ships navigating currents known only to some. Taverns filled with coded conversations. Hands discreetly exchanging coins in busy markets. Imagine all those people, countless millions across centuries, each making individual choices, each navigating their own path, and how these individual choices accumulated, created something larger. Connection networks that crossed empires, innovation currents that transformed societies, autonomy spaces that preserved human dignity. It's a beautiful image in a way, an invisible tapestry of human effort and creativity woven through millennia. And we, in our own time, continue weaving. Our struggles aren't identical, but they're part of the same eternal narrative. The sun sets over ancient civilizations, great cities fall silent, empires crumble to ruins. But something persists. The human quest to live with dignity, to create connections, to find ways to prosper, even in difficult circumstances. This doesn't die, doesn't disappear, just changes form, adapting to new contexts, but maintaining its essence. And maybe that's what these ancient stories offer us in the end. Not simple answers, not formulas to follow, but perspective. A reminder that we're part of something larger and more enduring than our immediate circumstances. That human experience is rich, complex, and remarkably consistent in its fundamental concerns. So as you prepare for sleep, after this long journey through ancient times, carry this with you, not as facts to memorize or lessons to apply, but as stories that become part of you. Stories that enrich your understanding of what it means to be human in any era, under any circumstances. May your rest be peaceful. May your dreams be populated by caravans under stars, by markets full of exotic aromas, by conversations in ancient languages, and may you wake with renewed appreciation for the complexity, resilience, and extraordinary creativity of human experience across ages. Good night. And thank you for traveling with me through these invisible economies, these shadows that shape the ancient world in ways we're only now beginning to fully understand.